In evolutionary biology, you distinguish between different strategies for reproductive and Darwinistic success. One of the axes on which you can do this is long-term and short-term orientation, which is also known as R strategy and K strategy. Short-term orientation makes more sense in unstable ecologies, and the inverse is the case for stable ones. For example, let's say that you live in an environment where 30% of men who reach puberty die of disease and another 30% die in war. This means that if you engage in a long-term reproductive strategy where you invest lots of time and lots of effort into your offspring, chances are you'll die before such a strategy will actually pay off. And investing current resources into the future means you aren't dealing with the incredibly serious problems of the present. There are short-term threats everywhere and constantly. That's what makes it an unstable ecology. What limits the population of the given organism is unpredictable and unstable. That's the whole idea. So really, you're actually worsening your odds of reproductive success by being long-term oriented in a short-term ecology. And even then, let's say you do pull it off successfully and you've taught your kids all sorts of useful things that they somehow wouldn't have learned otherwise, as if you have that much to teach them anyway, because again, there's not that much abstract knowledge to be gained when you're constantly worrying about short-term threats anyway, right? An illiterate guy can't teach his kids how to read, for example. But let's say you do this successfully and you teach your children something very useful. What you've now implicitly taught them on top of that, however, is that their environment is more stable than it actually is. For example, women who grew up in households without a father are more likely to be promiscuous. I mean, why do you think that is? Right? They are taught because of father absence that their environment is unpredictable and unstable, so they have to engage in short-term mating strategies rather than long-term ones where they put roadblock after roadblock in the way of the person that they might potentially find attractive in order to really be sure that he's long-term oriented enough to be a stable partner. Girls without a father don't do this anywhere near as much, obviously, because they subconsciously know due to the father absence that the environment is unstable. So, if in an unstable environment you go against the grain and act in a long-term oriented way and nurture your children as a male, and somehow succeed anyway, you're still reinforcing things that don't make sense in the ecology. Because, okay, now you've successfully raised your child in a long-term oriented way. Now what? The ecology is still unstable as hell, and the child will probably die by the time it's, let's say, 25 or whatever. Remember, 30% die of disease after puberty, and the other 30% die of war. Right? So this strategy will die out. If it's after 1 or 2 or 3 generations, the odds will catch up with you. They always do. Whether they catch up with you through your descendants or through you directly doesn't really matter in this case. In the end, you still lose by placing the wrong bet. Which is to say, you place your bet on long-term actions in an ecology that rewards short-term orientations. So, based on the principle of ego empowerment and aligning the ego with the larger structure of life, you would almost think that people who live in these unstable environments have a real obligation to kill, rape, genocide, and just in general to be reckless and barbaric. The tried and true strategy of killing all the men in the opposing tribe, killing the children and the elderly, and just taking the women as prizes has no better moral alternative. Taking the men as slaves won't work because you don't have agriculture. Caring for the children makes no sense because you just killed their parents and you share less genetics with them than your fellow tribesmen and whatnot. So if you let them grow up, they'll just try to kill you anyway. And same goes for the elderly. Assuming there even are any, which usually didn't happen, old people, as soon as they stop being useful to the tribe, would just go off and kill themselves, usually in some way, or they would be killed by other tribesmen for being useless and whatnot. But let's say they are there, then what? Can't use them for anything. They're on the opposing tribe. They hate you for just killing all their children. So what exactly is the other option besides killing them? Leaving them to die in the jungle on their own, or what? And with the women, it's also like, What else are you gonna do? You're just gonna leave them to die on their own now that they don't have any male protectors? They're gonna die without you, so you might as well take them for yourselves. It's like, it's the best option for the women, and it's the best option for you. Everyone is capable of winning if they do what's necessary to win, and everyone is playing by the same exact rules. There are no primitive tribesmen who think that waging wars of conquest is intolerable or immoral. It's simply the game that they have to play given the circumstances. And don't give me some pacifist love and forgive thy neighbor bullshit. Living beings reproduce until failure, resources are scarce, so who exactly gets to survive here? Not everyone. So how about it's the ones that are capable of winning? As I said, everyone's playing by the same rules here. And keep in mind that we ourselves, Westerners that is, we descend from the Indo-Europeans who genocided all the European locals, except for the Basques. We all descend from much more short-term oriented people in much more short-term centric systems and societies or ecologies or whatever the hell you want to call it. The rules of the game were simply different, and the constraints placed on the people at the time were unimaginably different from what we are experiencing now. This is why it's so foolish to judge history through a modern moral lens, where, in comparison, we have insanely reliable law enforcement which disincentivizes us from killing, plumbing which prevents disease, moral beliefs which make us conscious of externalities, and so forth. An externality, by the way, is just when you do something that negatively affects a third party. So, stealing, for example. It negatively affects the person you're stealing from, but your own ego is unscathed. I mean, you even benefit from the thing you're stealing, right? That's the idea. Even developing the system in your mind that keeps track of how other people are affected by your actions takes up actual effort. And this system doesn't exist in every culture. There are plenty of cultures where people just don't care in the slightest about externalities if they aren't personally affected. I mean, even in civilized societies like China, this is way less pronounced. And any of you who object to that, I imagine you've never dealt with Chinese people in your life. And that is to say, culturally Chinese people, not just ethnically Chinese people who live in the US as second generation immigrants or whatever. That doesn't count. Anyway, let's say you live in an environment that's hot and humid, meaning food preservation and thus long-term orientation is much more difficult. Or you have a low population density and no access to river navigation, meaning you're less able to engage in larger networks of specialization and wealth creation. You get the point. Some factors facilitate what we consider good, and some do the opposite. This is where factors like civilization come in, which increases stability and quality. For example, hunter-gatherers, who I'll just call savages from now on because, come on, since I'm already pissing off everyone, I might as well go all the way, right? And yes, I'm well aware that they live psychologically utopian lives here. That's not the point. I don't care about that for now. They have far lower population densities than the earliest civilized agricultural peoples. That's the point of farming. You get more calories per acre of land, meaning you have a larger population, which you can use to genocide the savages in war. This is what every single one of the civilizations that developed agriculture in an original way did. And then they spread agriculture everywhere else through genocidal conquest. And remember, there's a Darwinistic moral imperative here to genocide in this sort of primitive setting. Let me just mention something incredibly interesting. So, I said civilizations bring stability, right? For example, instead of having 30% of men die in war, it turns into maybe 3 or 5 or maybe 10%. And the source of people's suffering is much more stable, where instead of, let's say, half of the savages dying and the other half living a maximally fulfilling life, where every single day is a new adventure, you have almost everyone living pretty horrible lives, having to spend every year saving as much grain as possible so that they can replant in the next season, even accounting for random spoilage or accidents or theft throughout the winter. Even though your family is hungry right now, you can't go spending all your grain recklessly. Your back hurts all the time from farm work, your teeth hurt because the bread you eat is full of sand, and you're chronically short on all kinds of vital nutrients because you're on a 90% grain diet. If you lose control for even one day and you go out drinking and gambling because you just want to have fun for once, you might need to take out a loan to get through the year, and if you fail to pay that back, you'll have to sell yourself, your wife, or your kids, or maybe all, into slavery. Long-term planning obviously pays off in this setting, but Jesus fucking Christ is it tough. Anyway, what I wanted to mention is this. What's healthy for the individual and what's healthy for the society is sometimes diametrically opposed. For example, eating nothing but bread and dairy is obviously far less healthy than the savage's diet of wild fruits, wild fish, wild animals, and so forth. Remember the rigidity to fluidity gradient of the masculine and feminine. Obviously, civilization is masculine and solid. It thrives in colder and drier climates, rewards rationality and planning, and all that. Yes, I know that it used to be Northern Europeans that were the barbarians. That's because we didn't have good enough plows for population density in Northern Europe. This is besides the point here. The general principle that matters here is that coldness and dryness facilitate civilization as long as it's within the larger framework of life, obviously. That's why you won't find any super genius civilizations in the North Pole. So just try to keep this in the back of your mind if you can. Civilization and social complexity is held up by population density, which also facilitates interconnectivity and specialization. So, if we want to look at the most civilization-oriented food sources, we'd go by calories per acre, right? Well, look where that gets us. Soy, wheat, potatoes, rice, peanuts, corn, just to name a few. Let's look at the grains and potatoes first. All low in protein and fat, which are the two nutrient sources your body actually needs from external sources. If you don't eat protein for a year, you're probably going to die. Same goes for fat. Practically all the hormones and cell walls in your body are based on fats that you ingest, and it can't just be synthesized by your own system. Unlike carbs, which can be synthesized via gluconeogenesis. Just look that word up if you're bored or something. If you stop eating carbs for a year, odds are you're going to experience insane health benefits, though you might get constant brain fog, which is what I personally get when I try to do this. The point is, if you wanted to choose a nutrient that's bad for the individual, it would be exactly this sort of food, where many essentials are lacking or even missing entirely. The energy levels are destabilized due to them creating very strong insulin reactions, the carbs that is, which blocks access to the energy stored in your fat cells, meaning it creates a constant dependency, where going a few hours without eating causes an energy crash. Any of you who eat carbs frequently will be able to confirm that. Try skipping breakfast and see what your energy levels are at 1 p.m., right? Heavy exercise counteracts this negative insulin effect, which is why you can still have armies and farmers subsisting off of mostly grain without getting diabetes or whatever. Not only is eating this worse than the savage's alternative, actually making this food is far more arduous as well, especially historically speaking. I don't know if you've ever tried primitive wheat farming, and I certainly hope I'll never have to, but it's seriously hard and painful work, and you have to do it every day, almost. And this actually pales in comparison to primitive rice farming, where each individual grain of rice has to be picked out by hand while you're on your hands and knees in parasite-infested water, where the parasites and the disease are constantly sapping strength from your body. But you gotta keep going, because you're gonna starve otherwise. Oh, and this process also requires a lot of cooperation, keeping the rice irrigated and whatnot. So prepare to be bossed around for your whole life by the village elders. So you don't get to decide who to marry, where you live, when you work, when you eat, what you believe, and so on. The community comes first, because the alternative is starvation, because some feud broke apart the community. I don't know. Hey, I think this guy spit in my food. How dare you spit in my food? No, I didn't spit in your food. How dare you accuse me? What, you want to fight, huh? Is that your problem? There you go. Everyone starves now. Compare this to David Cho describing what life with the Hadza tribe is like, and the difference is night and day. I really recommend you watch the whole thing yourself, by the way. It's JRE number 1518. Anyway, here's a small part of it to give you an idea.
So if I walk with one of the kids and it's like him giving me a tour of his house, like, oh, come to Joe's warehouse, and he's showing me.
Right.
He's like grabbing a snake, biting his head off. He's like,
my
he's
God.
like, you want some thing? Climbing a tree.
He just grabbed a snake and bit its head off?
He takes out his slingshot, the rock, a pebble this big, bam, hits a fucking bush baby out of the tree, breaks his legs, puts it here. He's like, snack for later. Everything is talking. It's like, it looks like they're just goofing off and playing, but they have some what do you call it, microbes and gut biome kind of things in their stomach that no one else on the planet has. So the translator's explaining to me, Canadian scientists come and literally steal their shit. And the thing you never see in all the National Geographics and all the nature documentaries is that it's always serious. And here's the Hadza warrior, and here's, whatever nature. These guys crack, they're like, do you want to come with us tomorrow? Like, none of your eating Cliff Bars and hanging back. Like, you want to? I'm like, yeah, I'm in. Okay, we leave at first, the second.
How are they saying this all to you?
I have the translator with me.
Oh, okay.
He like works with them, and it's like worst case scenario when they don't do food. This is the sad part. They do the fake show for the tourists. Like, the tourists come in, usually European, and then they put on the fake. It's not fake, it's real, but they dress up and do like dances and stuff, and they give them money. Oh. So I wake up at 5:30, first noise, boop, and then laughter. I'm like, are these fuckers doing fart jokes at 5 a.m? And that's the thing that people don't realize is when you don't have TV, internet, entertainment, and you're just with your family and your homies all day, you're bored as fuck. So they joke morning till night. Like, I don't know what they're saying. Laughter. Someone cuts a fart, joke. And I'm like, all right, let's go. So you saw the pictures. Yeah. They're ripped, back muscles, 6-packs. The kids have 6-packs. I was very out of shape. I'm still out of shape, but I was the most out of shape. And think about waking up at 5:30 in the morning. And the thing that's the final animal that's like kind of left is baboons. They almost call them in that part of Africa like the baboon men, because that's what they eat. Tastes horrible to me. Baboons look human. So we're in a cave. Men sleeping on the top, women on the bottom. We wake up, there's another cave, and you see, oh, there's people in that cave. No, they're baboons. And they're pointing at us. They're like, look, they're coming. So I'm like, this shit is crazy. We're hunting baboons. They're like, there's tons of meat on them. It's enough to feed our family. Think about, like, running again. I was pretty fast in high school. I could do the 50 pretty quick. I can't run at top speed for hours. And I got these. I'm drinking water, and in this environment, it's an advantage to have black skin because it's cooling. These guys aren't sweating. I'm like, what's going on? We've been running for 5 hours. You guys aren't sweating. What the fuck? And they don't get tired, and then they'll just start digging a hole and drink like a handful of brown water, and that's enough for them. And I'm like, dude, what the fuck? And they're telling the translator, this motherfucker looks like he's never caught anything in his life. And he's like, he hasn't. And to me, I'm an alien, right? They go, he gets his food from supermarkets. What's that? They hunt the food for him. They cut it up and package it and sell it. Like, they don't believe it.
Right.
The shit I tell them, they're like, hey, you guys, you look like a fucking supermodel. Can I bring you to America and do a fashion thing and get you guys paid? And why would we want to go to America? Well, tell me what you know about America. Isn't that the place where people jump off buildings to kill themselves? Like, that concept is so foreign that when someone explained suicide to them, I was like, oh my God, they don't. And in the time that I'm there, like I said, that first week is withdrawal. I'm like, fuck, where's my phone? And then all of it goes away, right? I'm not thinking about any of my addictions. I'm not thinking about like I feel peace. I'm not miserable. My depression goes away. And I go, morning till night. You wake up, you hunt for food, you get home, celebration, everyone's happy that the men brought the food back, the women, gathered the berries. We have a big dinner celebration because every meal you got to be grateful for. Dance party by the fire, and you're out. A couple fart jokes, and you're out. Repeat the next day. There's no time to be like bored and sad and upset and worried about some bullshit.
As I said, it's psychologically utopian. The flow state is constant and anxiety is maximally diffused into the community. Anyway, let's move on to the fat sources. That's what we were doing, right? First the carbs, now the fats. So, high-density fats: peanut oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, soybean oil, rapeseed oil, also known as canola. They all share one pretty staggering trait. They have incredibly high ratios of omega-6 to omega-3 acid. And why does this matter? Well, let me just say, if you've watched my previous video, The Point of Existence, which if you haven't, just do that now real quick, it's just 2 hours. This part will absolutely blow your mind. Anyway, if you aren't familiar, these two fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6, are both essential to ingest, meaning your body doesn't produce them on its own. Keep in mind that nutrition studies are notorious for being unreliable, but what I'm about to say here is especially uncontroversial. So, omega-3 and omega-6 aren't distinguished by your body at any point in the digestion and absorption process. If you eat 20 times as much O6 as O3, which is pretty common nowadays, the ratio will be 20-1 in every part of your metabolism. And, what's recommended is usually 2-1 or 1-1, even though that's really unrealistic. But anyway, if you have a high omega-6 to 3 ratio, one of the consequences is chronic inflammation. Inflammation, in simple terms, is your body making your metabolism less efficient and more stressful to the body in order to put more energy into fighting threats. This can be bacteria, viruses, dirt in a wound, but it can also be pollen or other allergens, which are classified as threats by your immune system in this case, even though they may not do any damage to you if you just left them alone. Within your metabolism, that is. But you see, this is exactly the thing. There's no objective way to measure just how much you should be investing into getting rid of threats, or what constitutes a threat. There's just a gradient between this is 100% me, this is 100% bodily material, and on the other side you have this is 100% a threat, this is 0% part of the body. And then you have all this in between space. The same problem is seen when you deal with immigrants, for example. It's not objectively measurable how much foreignness should be tolerated. So some people are in favor of more immigration, and some people think that there's way too much going on. But it's the same fundamental mechanism of when does the foreign become a threat? So, the more you intake masculine, civilized, high crop density sources of fat, the more sensitive you are to foreignness, or in other words, non-conformity with your ego. Am I ringing any bells yet? What would you say are the societies most characterized by this in history? That's right, Hitler, Stalin. They had too much power, they were too rigid in their ideology, were too sensitive to threats, were too focused on their ego. In other words, they were too masculine. The Holocaust, the purges, the murdering of the kulaks, the censorship, the never letting go of even the most minor perceived insults. Hitler got upset that the congratulation letter for his birthday from the Danish king wasn't personal enough, so he demanded an apology. Or Stalin, when interrogating some poor guy, well, poor, they were communists, right? But when interrogating a guy who was falsely accused of supporting the Nazis, after they got a confession out of him via torture, he went down and made a speech to the guy, because, he was pretty high-ranking, and made a speech about exactly how he knew that he was guilty and why he was a traitor, and how Stalin knew. and it was very much a rant, not very coherent. But the interesting thing is, in the middle of this rant, he just randomly screams, "Kollektivizacja!" So, collectivization. And why did he do that? Well, it's because 10 years earlier, people were criticizing him for all the deaths that were happening during the forced collectivization process. There he was, doing what's right, imposing his will upon the world, imposing the just, righteous, socialist system upon the world, and those bastards had the cheek to criticize him for it. And he never forgave that. So, in the Hitler case and in the Stalin case, you get the point. Too focused on their own egos. Every single little thing is an unbelievably damaging slight to them, right? They over-perceive threats to their ego. Oh, and by the way, if you have more omega-6 in your cell walls, relatively speaking, it literally makes the cells more rigid and less flexible on a physical level. The pattern is just omnipresent, as I've explained in previous videos. Anyway, compare this to the primitive savage's diet. Wild-caught fish. The ratio is between 0.1 and 0.5, pretty far away from the 40, 50, or 5,000 of the civilized food sources. Meat from wild animals, 2, 3, maybe 4 to 1. Nuts have a worse ratio, often above 5 to 10 to 1. But again, you see the more domesticated varieties have far higher ratios. Again, crop yield density, civilization, rigidity, masculinity, they all represent the same fundamental force. Oh, and by the way, if you have a way too civilized mindset, which is something I go into in my better videos, it's up on screen right now, what I explain is the differences between feminine and masculine thought patterns. And the masculine thought pattern is purely causality oriented and rationally oriented, right? So if you're going at this with a way too overly masculine lens, you assume that all these statements are supposed to address causality. Like I'm saying that if Hitler ate more wild-caught salmon, he wouldn't have supported doing the Holocaust. It's not the case at all. This is not a causal argument in a scientific rational sense. If you want to know what it is instead, well, again, my other videos are better. Just watch them. Anyway, the point, as always, is that there's a balance to be met. On one end, you have a totalitarian hellscape where everyone eats potatoes with corn oil and corn syrup, and on the other, you have a bunch of relatively powerless savages where one guy with a gun can kill 1,000 of them if he does it well enough, and they fight each other for survival each and every day, and they eat almost perfect diets. Both ends of the spectrum are obviously identical in some ways and opposite in others. But the point is that in between, you have some optimum somewhere, some sort of balance that can be reached. What do you think about polygamy? It's perfectly reasonable if what you care about is evolutionary success, right? Well, not in a stable ecology it isn't. Not only do you have a perverse incentive structure where your wives are constantly trying to undermine each other because the shared genetics of their kids are non-existent from the different mothers' perspectives, and you obviously massively destabilize your society because you have a large group of sexually frustrated young men, but also in relation to just your own success as a parent. If you're a father with one wife in a stable environment, such as, let's say, the current West, which by historical standards is so goddamn safe and stable, it's just completely ridiculous. You gotta play with your kids and teach them what you know in other ways as well, because, playing with them is teaching them through implicit means. You don't know you're teaching them, but you do it anyway, and that's what matters. Anyway, you do this because that's what it takes for them to succeed in a civilized environment. 2-year-olds are the most violent group of humans on Earth, by the way. And there's no reason to think they wouldn't all become murderers and rapists like they would have been in the Stone Age if they weren't socialized by their parents and the broader society. Anyway, I've never heard of a single father who complained that he had too much free time or that he spent too much time with his kids. So really, one wife and one family is more than enough responsibility for one human anyway. In a well-functioning civilization, failing to socialize your 20 kids is going to play out worse than successfully socializing 2, especially if you consider the long term. I mean, what do you think will happen if there's a war or a famine? The first person to be killed for the benefit of the group is the troublemaker. Just like how robbers or rapists would be killed in medieval England, though not in the culturally primitive and backward Celtic areas in England, like, I don't know, West Cornwall or whatever, where, rape and burglary were just not that big of a deal, right? It just, happens sometimes, right? Boys will be boys. Anyway, so what do we learn from this? We learn that Islam is based. We also learn that the same principle of self-empowerment that makes rape and genocide not only acceptable, but also morally righteous in the pre-civilized world, is what makes being a good father, contributing to society, pursuing higher meaning, making yourself and your society more efficient, helping those you value, or whatever other shit you want to come up with. It makes all those things moral imperatives as well. Again, purely from a selfish Darwinistic perspective. Of course, in the very, very, very long term, being, let's say, altruistic, although I hate that word because it assumes that you have to sacrifice the ego for the group, which is not at all the case. Anyway, the very long term forces you to be altruistic because life itself can just end anyway, and then your genes are done, right? So, it's very much a matter of perspective. Anyway, if this video gets more than 2 views, I'm going to make heretical utterances about ethnic IQ distributions. I'm just kidding, guys. I'm kidding. I know it's because of culture. I know it's because of culture, mostly, okay? I realize that. I mean, maybe there's something to do with different gene groups having differential levels of inhibitory neurons in the prefrontal cortex from birth, but I know it's mostly cultural, okay? I know it's memetics, okay? Don't fucking kill me. Thanks. Okay, bye. Bye. Thanks for watching. Love you.